The Battle of Omdurman in 1898 in Sudan was the high point of Queen Victoria's British Empire, and in many ways it sort of provides the final closure to the story of Gordon of Khartoum. In 1885, General Charles Gordon was killed in the city of Khartoum in Sudan. He'd been defending the city against an Islamic insurgency led by Muhammad Ahmed, the self-proclaimed Mahdi. The British relief column marching up the River Nile under General Wolseley was too late. The British public were filled with anger and indignation that they hadn't been able to save their hero, Gordon, in Khartoum, and Queen Victoria herself was shouting for revenge. The British government, however, preferred to withdraw all their forces out of Sudan back to Egypt, where they were in de facto control. And a British officer was actually appointed Commander-in-Chief, or Sirdar, of the Egyptian army. Meanwhile, Sudan became a fundamentalist Islamic state ruled over by the Mahdi's successor, the Khalifa. Not content just to transform Sudan, he attempted to spread his form of Islamic revolution up into Egypt itself, where the British commander, the Sirdar of the Egyptian army, a man called General Francis Grenfell, met them and defeated the Sudanese or Dervish army at the Battle of Toski. Incidentally, General Grenfell gave his name to a road in Kensington, West London, which in turn gave its name to a tower block, Grenfell Tower, the site of a tragic fire in 2017. In 1892, a new Sirdar was appointed, General Horatio Herbert Kitchener. A gifted linguist, an Arabophile, socially cold but with incredible energy and a methodical planner, as you'd probably expect from a Royal Engineer, Kitchener had a burning ambition. Nearly a decade before, he'd been part of that relief column that had failed to rescue Gordon. He was a man bent on revenging his fellow Royal Engineer. And finally, in March 1896, Kitchener was given the order from the British government he'd been waiting for: retake Sudan. Kitchener was about to realise his dream of avenging Gordon. Meanwhile, back in London, the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, wasn't too fussed about any symbolic act of revenge. He was actually far more interested in realpolitik, which meant keeping the French out of Sudan during the final part of the scramble for Africa. Kitchener led a principally Egyptian and Sudanese exile army into Sudan with limited British support. It seems the British government liked the idea of controlling the Sudan instead of the French, but not actually spending any British taxpayers' money doing so. Kitchener had learned valuable lessons from the failed relief expedition nearly a decade beforehand. Trying to move an army up the River Nile had been incredibly time-consuming. So Kitchener, the Royal Engineer, came up with an alternative plan. He would take a shortcut by building a railway 230 miles across the harsh Nubian desert, reaching the River Nile further up. Despite scepticism from many military and political and indeed engineering quarters about the feasibility, Kitchener achieved this ambitious goal. His only problem was that the terminus of his proposed railway on the River Nile was at a place called Abu Hamad, a town that was held by the Dervish army. He decided to send a flying column of Egyptian and Sudanese troops under Major General Sir Archibald Hunter up the Nile to surprise the Dervish army. Hunter covered 146 miles in 7 days through the desert, and indeed he did surprise and defeat the Dervish army there. The way was now open for the railway to be finished and for the advance on Khartoum to really begin. And now Kitchener turned around to the government in London and said, actually, it would be very helpful if we had some British troops to augment his local army. And London obliged. In January 1898, battalions from the Royal Warwickshires, the Seaforth Highlanders, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders and the Lincolnshire Regiment landed in Egypt and started to head south to join Kitchener. By April 1898, his enlarged army of 10,000 fought a Dervish army of 15,000 at the Battle of Atbara, just off the River Nile. With a loss of just 80 men dead, his army inflicted over 2,000 dead on the Dervish. He captured the town, and indeed they captured the Dervish commander, Emir Mahmud. The door was now absolutely open to march on the Khalifa's capital at Omdurman, just across the River Nile from Khartoum. More reinforcements were sent. The Northumberland Fusiliers, the Lancashire Fusiliers, the Rifle Brigade and the Grenadier Guards all came to join Kitchener's army. By now, Kitchener's Nile army had grown to about 8,000 British troops and 17,000 Egyptian and Sudanese. As they advanced upstream, they were supported by a flotilla of 10 steamships commanded by Commodore Keppel from the Royal Navy, mounted with 36 guns and 24 machine guns. They were a lethal backup for his army. The immediacy of a showdown with Gordon's murderers and an imperial adventure produced a stampede of young officers seeking secondments to Kitchener's army, including the grandson or a grandson of the Queen Victoria herself. Adventure-seeking officers were particularly drawn to the 21st Lancers, a cavalry unit which was undermanned. In fact, the old Surdar's nephew, Lieutenant Grenfell, joined them, as, after considerable amount of pestering, did another young officer, namely Winston Churchill. On the 28th of August 1898, Kitchener's Anglo-Egyptian army made their final advance from their forward base at Wad Hamed towards the Khalifa's capital at Omdurman. Moving inland, they skirted the Shabluka Hill before returning back to follow the course of the River Nile upstream. By the 31st of August, they had reached the last physical barrier before their goal, the Kerreri Hills. The following day, the 1st of September, Kitchener sent out mounted reconnaissance parties to see what lay in store ahead. Would the Khalifa fight, as Kitchener hoped he would, or would he simply melt away into the vastness of the Sudanese hinterland and fight a never-ending guerrilla war? By 7 a.m. on the 1st of September, the 21st Lancers had reached the summit of the Kerreri Hills. Ahead of them, across a 3-mile sand and scrub plain with the Nile to their left, lay the black stone outcrop of Jebel Surgham, which blocked their view of Omdurman beyond. Moving warily across the open plain, they reached the outcrop and ascended unopposed. Where was the Dervish army? Now at the top of the rocky outcrop, they trained their binoculars south. They could see the mud city of Omdurman with its massive minarets and, shimmering in the centre, an egg-shaped dome of the Mahdi's tomb. To the left, across the river where the two Niles meet, was the remains of Khartoum, where Gordon had died in the governor's palace. The city had actually been left derelict since that defeat by the order of the Khalifa. Panning their binoculars through the haze heat, they could see to the right of Omdurman, about 4 miles from their position, a brown smear of a zariba, which is like an encampment. And then something strange happened. The zariba started to move. If you're enjoying this story, then please click the like button below and also subscribe to hear more stories in the future. The men of the 21st Lancers suddenly realised they were not looking at a mud wall of an encampment, but the front line of the Khalifa's massive army. This huge army now started to advance towards them. Moving at a swift walk, it came across the scrub. And then just before 2 p.m, as suddenly as the mass had started, it came to a stop. Firing a volley of shots into the air, the Khalifa's whole army settled down to sleep before the sun became stronger. Meanwhile, the flotilla of steamboats under Commodore Keppel and a junior officer, David Beatty, had been sailing alongside the Lancers and had now moved on closer to Omdurman and opened fire on the city, breaching the walls in several places and demolishing the entrenched Dervish batteries on either side of the Nile. They then moved to the east bank and met up with Arab irregulars who'd been recruited by Kitchener, who'd been moving up the left bank. Securing the bank just before Tutti Island, Keppel was now able to offload a company of artillery with howitzers. Protected by the Arab irregulars, this battery now proceeded to bombard Omdurman, causing significant damage, not least to the Mahdi's tomb itself. Kitchener's main army was now in between the Kerreri Hills and the Jebel Suram on that 3-mile plain that the Lancers had observed the day before. He moved in position for what was obviously going to be the coming battle. With the Nile at his back, he positioned his army in a crescent shape, bulging out into the plain, with the British brigade at the north end, closest to the Jebel and Omdurman, and the Egyptian and Sudanese brigade at the southern the Kerreri Hill end. The naval flotilla was moved to provide artillery and machine gun support at each end of the crescent. And then Kitchener's army waited all afternoon, and then into the night. Kitchener prepared his army for the obvious nighttime attack that must be coming, but it never came. And I wonder what thoughts must have been going through his men's head in that eerie desert darkness as they waited that night. I wonder how highly strung the nerves were as they listened for any sound of a stealthy advance by the Dervish army. And whilst they were a lot better armed than the Dervishes, they knew that these fanatical warriors had previously managed to break into British squares back during the Gordon Campaign. If they'd done it once, they could do it again. And when they did, suddenly all those superior rifles versus the razor-sharp swords and spears, well, what would happen? At 4:30 a.m. on the 2nd of September 1898, bugles in the Anglo-Egyptian camp sounded the reveille. Kitchener wondered if the Dervish army had slipped away during the night. Before dawn broke, Kitchener had sent out a unit of Egyptian cavalry commanded by another British officer, Captain Baring, westwards across the plain to see if the Dervish army were coming towards them. And around dawn, the 21st Lancers were once again sent forward to scout the Jebel Suram. Retracing their steps from the previous day, the Lancers ascended the black rocky outcrop, half expecting to meet the Dervish army coming over the slopes towards them. But they didn't. And reaching the summit, they peered north in the growing light to where the Dervish army had last been seen yesterday afternoon. Had they slipped away under the cover of darkness? No, they were exactly where they had sat down, waiting for the British. At 5:50 a.m, the Dervish army, 50,000 strong, let out a huge cheer and started to advance. The Khalifa's army broke into 4 roughly equal columns, each led by a coloured flag. The green flag column came round the western end of the Jebel outcrop, but instead of swinging right towards Kitchener's encampment, they continued north across towards the Kerreri Hills. In between them and the hills was Colonel Broadwood with an Egyptian cavalry and the Camel Corps. The swift-moving Dervish forces were coming on really too fast for comfort, especially as the camels' soft feet were not coping well with the stony ground. The naval flotilla gave them covering fire as they fell back towards the British encampment, and meanwhile Broadwood and his Egyptian cavalry continued to move back towards the Kerreri Hills, and the green flags gave chase. The Khalifa had actually ordered the green flag column to go towards the Kerreri Hills and wait for developments during the battle. If Kitchener attempted to advance on Khartoum, the green flag were to attack him from the rear. But now, as they were faced by this annoying Egyptian cavalry snapping at them, firing at them, they set off in pursuit. And Broadwood was able to actually draw the the green flag 3 miles away from the main battle. Meanwhile, what was happening elsewhere on the battlefield? The Khalifa ordered the white flags to advance over the Jebel outcrop onto the plain that faced Kitchener's encampment, whilst the red flag column under veteran commander Osman Azrek swept round the western end of the Jebel, joining with the white flag on that plain facing Kitchener. And then they advanced. That left the Khalifa under his black flag in reserve with 15,000 of his best warriors, under the command of his most trusted commander, Yaqub. As the red column advanced onto the plain and met the white flags, the Anglo-Egyptian army opened fire with their 44 guns and 20 maxim machine guns, punching huge holes in the Dervish host as it advanced towards them. Despite their mounting losses, the brave Dervish army continued to advance, all the time shouting passages from the Holy Quran. They now came into range of the infantry to open fire. The British brigade were armed with Lee Metford bolt-action magazine rifles capable of firing 20 rounds a minute with an effective range of 800 yards. The Dervish troops attacking this end of Kitchener's position did not get within 800 yards of his army, and making absolutely no progress in the face of this withering fire, they lay down and those with rifles started to fire back. Meanwhile, at the other end of the crescent, the northern end, the Egyptian and Sudanese battalions were armed with a slightly more antiquated Martini Henry rifles, which were used by the British in campaigns such as the Zulu Wars 20 years beforehand. With a rate of fire of about 12 rounds a minute, which is about half the Lee Metfords, and an effective range of about 400 yards, again about half the Lee Metfords. This effectively meant that the northern end of the crescent was the most vulnerable to the massed attack of the Dervish. But even here, the well-disciplined Egyptian and Sudanese put the brakes on the advance 300 yards from their line. One lone flag-waving Dervish warrior managed to charge to within 150 yards. Whilst the Dervish riflemen lying on the stony ground were inflicting casualties on Kitchener's troops, it was nothing in comparison to the massacre that was taking place to the red and white flag sections of the Khalifa's army. Blind courage and religious faith were basically no match for industrial warfare. Osman Azraq, the veteran commander of the Red Flag, continued to charge towards the British lines until he was mowed down. Making no progress, the shocked dervishes started to fall back around the Jabal towards Omdurman. Kitchener dryly observed that the Khalifa's army had received a, quote, good dusting, and now decided to advance rapidly on Omdurman before the Dervish could regroup or organise some sort of urban defence. And trying to take a town, as we all know, costs lives, costs an attacker a lot of lives. And Kitchener wanted to avoid that at all costs. The decision to give chase almost immediately, however, was a costly decision, which nearly ended in disaster. The 21st Lancers advanced out of the southern end of the Zeriba and once more towards the Jebel Suram outcrop. An advanced scout, Lieutenant Grenfell, rode back to the commander of the 21st Lancers, Lieutenant Colonel Martin, and he reported there was a force of about 700 to 1,000 Dervish blocking the route to Omdurman on the other side of the outcrop. Martin decided to clear them from Kitchener's path. The 21st Lancers were the newest cavalry regiment in the British Army. They'd only been established after the Indian Mutiny 40 years beforehand. They'd never seen proper action, and by proper action I mean for a cavalry regiment, a proper full-blown cavalry charge. In fact, other cavalry units in the British Army unkindly said that the 21st Lancers' motto was "Thou shalt not kill." This sort of lack of action and the ridicule it had attracted rankled Lieutenant Colonel Martin. And now finally, here was a chance to do what they'd been set up to do. He ordered all 4 squadrons of his regiment forward beyond the black-rocked Jebel towards Omdurman. About 250 yards away was a line of white-robed dervish who proceeded to open fire on the Lancers. Martin ordered his cavalry to wheel into an extended line facing the enemy, and then they charged. And as they galloped towards the dervish lines, a terrifying sight met them. The white-robed rifleman was standing on the edge of a khor, which is like a dip in the ground, and inside that khor were 2,500 dervish warriors. It was too late for the Lancers to stop. Momentum carried them straight into this host. For many of the Lancers, the sheer momentum of their charge carried them all the way through the dervish ranks and up the other side of the col. But for those whose momentum was checked, it became a fight for their lives. The Mahdist warriors used their razor-sharp swords to cut the hamstrings of the horses, bringing them crashing down. Riders were then pulled from their horses and cut to shreds by the enraged dervishes with their swords and spears. Winston Churchill, famously taking part in this charge, used a pistol to fire at attackers at point-blank range and was able to actually ride through this throng. 3 Victoria Crosses were awarded to the riders who went back to rescue their comrades, including a daring rescue of an injured officer, a Lieutenant Molyneux, who was trapped and surrounded by the dervish, but was rescued by his men. Regrouping his men, 200 yards beyond the core, Martin decided that one cavalry charge was enough for that day and ordered his men to fire with their guns instead at a safe distance. And the Dervish army melted away. And so ended one of the last great cavalry charges of the British Army. It was a charge that had cost 21 Lancers their lives, including Lieutenant Grenfell, and a further 50 were injured, including Lieutenant Molyneux, who we've just talked about. Whilst the 21st Lancers were finally conducting a cavalry charge, Kitchener was assembling his army for their march into Omdurman. At 9:15 a.m, just an hour after the Dervish army had withdrawn from the plain, the army formed into a column to move forward. The British brigades, who were at the end of the Zebira closest to Omdurman, were therefore placed in the vanguard, moving abreast of each other. And 3 Sudanese and 1 Egyptian battalion under Colonel Maxwell were next in line, followed by 4 Egyptian battalions under Colonel Lewis. And finally, Brevet Colonel Hector MacDonald would bring up the rear with his Sudanese Egyptian battalions. The vulnerable point in this whole advance was going to be MacDonald's rear guard. If the Dervish attacked out of the Kariri Hills, they would fall upon his brigade. And Kitchener was well aware of that vulnerable point in his column and had deliberately chosen MacDonald for this role. Hector MacDonald is a bit of a hero, actually. He was the son of a Scottish crofter who had risen through the ranks, something incredibly rare in a class-ridden Victorian army. During the Second Afghan War, he'd served with such gallantry that he was actually offered a choice: a Victoria Cross, the highest reward for gallantry in the British Army, or a commission. And he chose the latter. He had already drilled his Sudanese Egyptian brigade into a proven fighting force who had more than held their own against the Dervish at the Battle of Abu Hamed and at Atbara during the advance up the Nile. To make way for Lewis's brigade to move past him and into line, MacDonald moved his brigade slightly out to the west on the plain. But, so far so good. We were all moving forward. And then Kitchener looked to his right and saw the Khalifa's black flag and 15,000 warriors coming round the Jebel towards him onto the plain. His army turned to engage them. Meanwhile, MacDonald, who was sort of out on a limb at the far end, brought 3 of his battalions, the Sudanese 9th, 10th and 11th, at right angles, facing the black flag, almost creating a crossfire. He left 1 battalion, his Egyptians, facing the Kariri Hills, just in case. So he'd sort of formed like an inverted L. British troops in the vanguard stormed to the top of the Jebel, carrying a maxim machine gun. And now Yaqub's black flag came into like a tunnel, facing the whole of Kitchener's army, with MacDonald's firing from the right and the maxim machine gun up on the Jebel from the left. It was a bloodbath, lacking any advantage except blind courage and bravery. The Dervish army was decimated. The remnants of the Black Flag column streamed past the Khalifa towards Omdurman. And now the Green Flag column suddenly came out of the Kariri Hills, straight towards MacDonald's isolated position exposed at the very back of the column, with just his Egyptian battalion facing them. It was now that Hector MacDonald came into his own. His nearest Sudanese battalion felt confident enough to pivot away from facing the black flag and came alongside their Egyptian comrades. And MacDonald swiftly brought the other 2 battalions alongside them. This was like a parade ground marching manoeuvre conducted in the midst of a battle, and he pulled it off just in time. With his whole brigade firing as rapidly as a Martini Henry rifle would allow them, they managed to stop the Green Flag column just 300 yards from their line. If the Green Flag column had attacked maybe 15 minutes beforehand whilst MacDonald was facing the Black Flags, it could have all been very different at the Battle of Omdurman. When the smoke cleared, MacDonald's men had fired 60 rounds. Some only had 2 rounds left in their pouches. This time, the Battle of Omdurman was well and truly over. The Battle of Omdurman was a completely one-sided victory. The Anglo-Egyptian army had lost under 500 men killed and wounded. A fifth of those were from the charge of the 21st Lancers. The Dervish army, on the other hand, had lost over 10,000 dead and a similar number wounded. Kitchener advanced into Omdurman, which despite the Khalifa's orders had been abandoned without a fight. The Khalifa himself had fled with what remained of his army to the southern expanses of Sudan. Kitchener ordered the Mahdi's tomb to be destroyed and his bones to be scattered. It was a vindictive revenge for the death of Charles Gordon all those years before. He then crossed the river to Khartoum, where in the grounds of the governor's derelict palace, a service of memorial was heard. As the final hymn, Abide With Me, finished, many soldiers noted that Kitchener, the cold, methodical, scientific soldier, was weeping. Gordon had finally been avenged. Kitchener returned to Britain as an imperial hero. Elevated to the peerage as Lord Kitchener of Khartoum, he presented Queen Victoria with the Caliph's captured black flag. Strangely, seeing as the Raging Queen had been one of the most vocal Avenged Gordon cheerleaders, she was rather disturbed that the Mahdi's tomb had actually been desecrated by Kitchener. And indeed, reports of wounded Dervish being killed by British soldiers on their commander's orders, and rumours that Kitchener had actually kept the Mahdi's skull as an inkwell, took a bit of a shine off the victory and the Empire's latest hero. But despite that, he was a victor, and he was a man who proved that if you wanted to win, he was the man you wanted in charge. The Khalifa remained at large until the following year, when an Anglo-Egyptian force under Reginald Wingate killed him in a battle, and it effectively ended the Mahdist cause for good. Sudan was to remain under Anglo-Egyptian control, really just Anglo control, until it achieved independence in 1956. And in 2011, the country divided into Sudan and the new nation of South Sudan. Many of the officers at Omdurman went on to feature heavily in Britain's last great imperial war, the Boer War in South Africa, and the First World War. Lieutenant Colonel Smith Dorrien was to command the retreat at Mons in World War I. David Beattie from the flotilla was to command the British fleet at the Battle of Jutland. And Major Douglas Haig was to go on to command the British Army on the Western Front. Kitchener himself was to command the second part of the British in the second part of the Boer War, where he overcame a tenacious guerrilla campaign mounted by the Boers. And at the outset of World War I, he oversaw a massive mobilisation which saw over 2 million British men volunteer to join the armed forces in the opening 12 months of the war. He actually died when a ship he was travelling on to wartime ally Russia hit a German mine off the coast of Scotland. And here's my final anecdote from the Battle of Omdurman of 1898. Do you remember Lieutenant Molyneux from the charge of the 21st Lancers? He'd been unseated, he had to be rescued, he was badly injured, he actually needed a skin graft. Well, the man who gave him that skin graft was another Omdurman veteran who would feature in the Boer War and World War I and World War II. Yeah, you've guessed it, Winston Churchill. If you enjoyed this video and like what I'm about, then become a supporter for less than the cost of a pint a month. Details are appearing in a link right at the top of the screen right now, and they're also in the description below. Keep safe, and I'll see you with some more great stories very soon.